Welcome to Galaxy Brains.
An infinite amount of cash.
I'm your host, Alex Thorn.
The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Bitcoin made a new all-time high.
If you're not long, you're short.
Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet, all Bitcoin's going to be erased.
Bitcoin's the best crypto asset.
Bitcoin is going to zero.
Welcome back to Galaxy Brains. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorn, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy Digital. This is the Nashville tapes, and on this edition, we're talking with Casey Rodarmor, Bitcoin developer, inventor of inscriptions and Ordinals. It's a fascinating conversation. Also going to talk with Casey about his new file-sharing project, not related to Bitcoin or crypto, but also very interesting. It's a fascinating one. Let's get right into the talk. Before we get to the show, I need to remind you, please refer to the link to the disclaimer in the podcast notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Welcome, Casey Rodarmor, creator of Ordinals and Runes on Bitcoin. Welcome back to Galaxy Brains, Casey.
My man, Alex Thorn, it's been a while. I'm very glad to be back.
We met on Clubhouse. Remember those days?
Yeah, that's right.
That was good times.
Before Twitter Space.
God, that was a moment, you know?
It was. It was like really before the Eternal September.
It really was.
Like
there was like
niche.
a 6 months right in there.
Yep.
They declined an acquisition offer from Facebook.
Looks like a mistake at this point.
It does. Casey, I want to talk to you about Ordinals a little bit and Runes and Bitcoin, but also a new project. You were telling me right before we were recording that you were working on a new file sharing project. Which you and I both share a common interest in. Let's start, though, and for our audience, I think Casey was on Galaxy Brains February 7th of 2023.
Right in the depths of the madness of
This is when I
Ordinals
was
just
like,
rocketing into the sky.
Wanted to, I inscribed my own avatar. I ended up not being sub 10K. I was 10,888. Check it out. Although eights are lucky in China.
Are lucky.
So,
that's true, yeah.
But this was the era when you had to go to like a Dennis Porteau and be like, it was like over-the-counter inscriptions. Like it was right before the bots and Ordinals bot and all these companies emerged, and they emerged fast. That was a great episode. I encourage people to check that out. There was a good rap in there too, where I was.
There's always a good rap.
Yeah. But a lot has changed since then. My gosh. I mean, we wrote a report, came out about a month after that, where we just predicted, we had good reasons for it, but that the Ordinals digital art market, we didn't even foresee the emergence of fungible tokens built on Ordinals, but that it would be, I think we said $4.5 billion worth by 2025. So
where are we on that?
I think if you included the BRC20 tokens, we did get to like 2 or 3 billion.
Wild.
I think there's still time. I think, frankly, the NFT markets have been in shambles overall.
Absolutely, and I think that stuff on Bitcoin sort of, it goes in cycles with the cycles that the Bitcoin asset itself goes through, right? And so I expect, the next bull market that starts ripping our faces off, all the memes and all the altcoins on Bitcoin will also pump.
Yeah,
which is not investment advice. I only buy Bitcoin. I only recommend that people buy Bitcoin.
Yeah.
If you want to like degen in the casino, like go for it. But Bitcoin is, the only real asset that matters.
And absolutely. And we I think core to our thesis there was that I really didn't think it would be used for profile picture collections or fungible token standards, partly because Ethereum is literally purpose-built for that. But we did think, in particular, the high fidelity of Bitcoin's block space, the permanence, the immutable nature of it. I almost think of Bitcoin's ledger, when we think of it this way, as a digital stone tablet. Yep. So we thought luxury items, high-value art projects. In fact, to their credit, I really liked that project that Yuga Labs did. I thought was quite interesting. Their generative art project, I forget what it was called, something Fold, 12-fold, or maybe 13-fold. They did a good Ordinals project that I thought was closer to the types of art that I hope we'll continue to see. And by the way, there are. I mean, you can scroll through ordinals.com and see like there's a ton of really interesting stuff that people are putting there.
I think that stuff is going to happen. I think it takes a long time. Like if you look at aesthetic movements in traditional art, they take decades to really fully form. From very early experiments with cubism and abstract art, in the 50s and the 60s, they take a long time to develop. And so I think that those things will happen. It just takes a long time, especially for traditional collectors to start to get into digital art. But I do think it's going to happen, and I do think it's going to happen on Bitcoin.
I just can't believe that people were doing digital art decades ago and then like selling you printed out like copy of the code they used to generate it, and that's all you could do. Putting the code on the chain in a way, and there are some Ethereum projects that do this, and CryptoPunks are all stored on chain. But that seems like a no-brainer to me in general.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's really natural. And I think a lot of people go like, oh, well, like anybody can look at the JPEG, anybody can like right-click download. But I think that actually misses something about traditional art collecting in that a large component of it is the ownership of the work, separate from the exclusive right to view the work.
Yeah.
Right? And traditional art collectors, they know this. And everybody kind of knows what they're buying. They're not buying the right to view the JPEG. They're viewing the right to own the JPEG. And it's quite, abstract and weird to think of ownership of a digital object separate from actual, some kind of physical possession of it.
Yeah, it is interesting. In fact, a lot of people that own famous or beautiful art, they do display it to the public in museums and stuff, but they also own it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You go to a museum and somebody bought some, $10 million like painting,
Yeah.
and then it says like on loan from Bob and Deborah, so and so, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, why did they buy it?
Right, and this was a criticism that I had of the NFT market, and I think what we're saying is a pretty valid pushback to the criticism, which was that one of my views of blockchain ledgering of assets is that it's great for tracking ownership and maintaining ownership, but most NFT projects don't actually confer ownership. It's closer to a lease agreement.
Sure, yeah, and you get all these weird IP agreements.
Right.
You get weird stuff with royalties. I always didn't want to do any kind of royalties. I think royalties are kind of stupid. I think if you own something, you should just straight up own something. But the ultimate end state of attempting to do royalties is what we're seeing on Ethereum right now, which is everybody is kind of realizing that it doesn't work. And big players, I think Yuga Labs, like essentially threatening to sue you if you attempt to
saying that you can only trade our stuff on this
Exactly.
or that exchange that enforces royalties.
Yep.
I think Blur was one of the first to refuse to honor any royalties, so it became really popular for people that trade NFTs. Yeah, it's kind of a never-ending cycle. I don't think people realized this until a couple years ago that actually NFTs can't enforce royalties.
No,
on
absolutely
chain,
not. Yeah,
because you can always just wrap it and then just move the wrap version.
Exactly, you can wrap it. I mean, fundamentally, this is a fundamental limitation of blockchains, which is that they don't know anything about the real world, right? And this is why all this like lettuce on the blockchain stuff like doesn't work, right? But the information of the real sale price is not available on the blockchain. You can slip somebody, cash, you can wrap it, you can underreport it, you can do all sorts of shenanigans, right? And so, yeah, fundamentally, it just doesn't work. There's no way you can guarantee that the
Right.
contract is going to have that information.
But you can store and transfer the items themselves, and regardless of, and people are doing that. And Ordinals was the first time at scale, obviously, that it's been done on Bitcoin. Obviously, there were, things like Counterparty or Colored Coins were doing with not with images per se, but there were people like Dennis Porteau, my friend, who's an Operturn maximalist.
Operturn
right?
Maxi?
Yeah. He has a Taproot Wizard, which says Operturn on it, which is like, I guess, his claim to fame. But nobody had done it at scale on Bitcoin until Ordinals, and it has turned into a scale.
It's interesting. I think about this a lot. Like, there were all these earlier systems, and why didn't they take off? And one of the things that I've kind of come to eventually is that I think that it has to do partially with the fact that Ordinals, inscriptions, and now runes, they actually integrate really well with the rest of the Bitcoin technology stack. If you look at something like Counterparty, Counterparty is essentially a totally different system that's totally divorced from the way that Bitcoin works, and you're just putting these messages for this entirely different system that happen to be in a Bitcoin transaction. But with Ordinals, inscriptions, and runes, they're very Bitcoin native. When I want to do something with some inscriptions that is hard to do with Ord, the software that I wrote, and it's hard to do because my software is crappy and it's missing a lot of features, I go use Sparrow, right? And Sparrow doesn't actually need to know anything at all about Ordinals and inscriptions in order to like manipulate them profitably. And this is really, comes down to the fact that, Ordinals addresses are just Bitcoin addresses. They're UTXO based. So the same technology that lets you manage your UTXOs in your wallet lets you manage your inscriptions and runes, et cetera. Runes are a little bit more complicated because runes actually, when you want to do a a non-trivial transfer, you have to include some data in an op return. But for simple transfers, if you're transferring everything in a UTXO, Sparrow will do just fine.
Yeah.
And so I think it's actually that like integration that made it take off when previous systems failed. Because I can't build everything, and the other people who work on it with me, they can't build everything. So essentially having all this pre-existing technology in the Bitcoin ecosystem that interoperates is incredibly helpful for adoption and just scaling the technology on a technical and social level.
Yeah, it really is Bitcoin native in that sense. You can do multi-sig custody of inscriptions.
Exactly.
You can do basically anything, to your point.
Yeah, like back to
You need
counterparty.
you need UTXO selection. That's the basic thing that you need, right? To be
Exactly.
cautious with
Yep.
not accidentally sending them. But
And for example, counterparty assets are not custodied. They're not locked by Bitcoin script. So counterparty didn't have multisig for a long time because they just hadn't implemented it, and they finally implemented it, but it was a long time. Contrast that with inscriptions. The next time we get some upgrade to Bitcoin, whatever it may be, that technology will automatically benefit ordinals and inscriptions.
Yeah.
And it's also nice from my point of view because people are like, I want to do like X, Y, and Z. Like, why didn't you add it? And I'm like, inscriptions are as programmable as Bitcoin. We just kind of got to wait for Bitcoin to become more programmable. I can kind of beg off like, no, I don't have to do anything right now.
so Runes launched at the halving block.
That's right.
Which
Yep.
is what, 840,000, block 840,000,
Sounds about right.
I think.
Yep.
And which was, I'd say April maybe, I'm thinking back, April or early May.
April or May 20th.
Yeah, I can't remember, but time is a flat circle and a lot is happening.
That's right.
So Runes is a different protocol, right? Does it also uses inscription?
It does not. It does not. Yeah, it's a totally
Tell us
different.
about it.
Yeah, so it all comes back to like I forget when BRC20 launched, but I had made inscriptions, which is just a non-fungible token protocol. And around like
I think it was like spring of 23. It wasn't that long after. It was
spring of 23, I go to ordinals.com and all of a sudden it's all these JSON text blobs. Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, like what is this? And it got extremely popular. Like the degens, they thirst for fungible tokens. They want high speed turbo degenning. And so BRC20 is based on inscriptions. And so it actually inherits a lot of complexity from inscriptions. It's essentially like one very complicated protocol, ordinals and inscriptions, and then on top of that, another set of rules that just kind of uses inscriptions as a data carrying layer, kind of like counterparty embeds data in Bitcoin transactions. And so I eventually got kind of irritated with all the JSON blobs on ordinals.com, and there were a lot of shortcomings of BRC20, things like you could front run somebody's choice of name. It doesn't integrate quite as well with Bitcoin software. It's not UTXO based, it's address based. And so I was like, all right, I guess the degens want it. I'm gonna do a fungible token protocol.
Yep.
And so the goal with Runes is really to create something like very simple. And that's why it's separate from inscriptions. It's a very simple protocol. The core is, messages are in op returns. They're called rune stones, and they dictate how the runes in each UTXO move from the inputs to the outputs. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the core of the protocol, it's something like 2,000 lines of code. Just look at this transaction, update the database entries for the inputs and outputs. And I'm really happy with how it's been received. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but just what I've been hearing from a technical point of view is like, this is great. It's easy to integrate. It's simple. It's lightweight. The software works well. Mm-hmm. No real weird things that have happened. Like when you release something, really all you care about is please let there be no bugs. Please let there not have been some crazy oversight that I didn't think about that now the system is burning to the ground. So that has happened. There have been no bugs. There's one tiny bug, one little one, but it was a baby bug. So yeah, it's working as intended.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and they're all they're all S coins. I wouldn't tell anybody to go buy any of them. Yeah. But technically it works, and I think it's fun to be able to have this degenerate Sky Casino.
I think it is very interesting, the idea that the DTCC wrote a paper in 2016 that was, I think, really ahead of its time. This is the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. They're the ones that technically custody all U.S. equities. Mm-hmm. So when you own a stock at Fidelity.com, really they just tell the DTCC that now this share is actually held at Fidelity on Casey's behalf.
Layers of indirection are wild,
and they wrote a paper that said basically blockchains should disintermediate us. And and it was very forward thinking. I think they're still right. We haven't seen that, obviously, but they are the definition of a centralized intermediary. And actually, the story is kind of interesting. It used to be totally peer-to-peer, bilaterally settled between brokerage houses. Shares, you sell 100 shares of Apple at your brokerage firm, and I buy at mine, and like we have to actually physically move those specific non-fungible shares.
Somebody runs it over
literally
at the end of the week.
And stock investing exploded in the 60s, and literally shares were getting like dropped in puddles and like left on desks. It was so bad they called it the paperwork crisis on Wall Street. A quarter of all brokerage firms went out of business. NYSE had to close at noon every Wednesday to give 4 extra hours for all the record keeping that was happening. So they created a centralized intermediary. And I always think about how if our natural state was to just work directly with each other.
Absolutely.
But sometimes complexity ends up leading to centralization. If only there had been a technology.
Yep.
And so the long point of the story is that I think in many ways that similarly the way number go up might orange pill someone to then become a truer Bitcoiner later, like come for the gains and stay for the world-changing movement. So too might random
Just seeing
shitcoin
direct
protocols
settlement between two parties.
It's like the domino, like Casey releases inscriptions, and then like 10 dominoes later is like overhaul of the U.S. financial system. So
I think somebody else launched the first domino, but I definitely appreciate the compliment.
Yeah, well, and I'll lead you to a question here is, maybe we are only seeing meme coins and stuff like that for the most part on Runes today or PRC20s. I'm not aware of any that have any real utility on the network, partly because you can't really do anything with tokens on Bitcoin.
You can't really do anything with tokens, period. I mean, if you look at, what are the actual use cases that have product market fit, they're essentially just speculation and gambling, right? There's like DeFi. DeFi is just weird ways of like redressing a Ponzi scheme. I think probably the only things that have utility are really centralized stablecoins, right?
So this was going to be my question. Could you build a stablecoin on Runes or on BRC20s for that matter?
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Can you do like creation and redemption?
So for technical reasons, I have it so that all Runes, when you create them up front.
Fixed supply, right?
Fixed supply. There's that avoids a lot of technical complexity and a lot of nasty surprises. But if you were a stablecoin issuer, what you would do is you're like, okay, I'm going to create literally 2 to the 64 units, which is more units than you ever possibly need. It's like trillions of trillions.
Yeah.
And then just keep them in reserve in cold storage. And when somebody sends you $1, you send them one of those, and you can publish your reserve address so you can be audited. And whenever somebody wants to get their dollar back, you either burn it or you send it back to this sort of central reserve.
I think that was what I had guessed the way to do this was. I didn't realize you could do that many units.
Oh, yeah, 2 to the 60.
So
no, 2 to the 128.
So
sorry, it's an absurd number. It's like more
that's
atoms.
2 times 2, 128 times.
That's right, and it's more units than like atoms in the galaxy.
Okay, so we're good then.
We're good. Yeah,
I was like, oh, maybe the max is like 21 million or some number, and then it's like, well, even then, you just create another one, and you're like, okay, this is like USDB for Bitcoin 1, USDB 2, USD. They're all the same. They're all managed by the same issuer. But in any case, okay, so it is possible.
Yeah, certainly could do it. And
I haven't heard of anyone trying to do this yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of some sort of more technically complicated stable coins that are trying to do some like staked vaulted thing where you like vault your Bitcoin. I think all those are just a terrible idea. As unfortunate it is that the major stablecoin issuers are centralized, I would much rather something centralized that works than something that's like pseudo-decentralized or decentralized with a bunch of weird long-tail risks, like Terra Luna, that it's just going to explode. Right. And I made Runes, I really made it for like, meme coins and like, degeneracy. But it's a solid protocol. There's no reason that you can't use it. Well, that's sort of what
I'm saying is like, just like number grow up could lead to Bitcoin movement, maybe like degeneracy could lead to financial system.
I think you got to target the degens first. The degens are going to be first through the door. They're going to be the first users of your technology. So if anybody is building, I would say like, build for the degens.
Yeah,
first.
I mean, it's like CryptoKitties was like the first big NFT project on Ethereum, and then you eventually got actual art. I mean, I'm a big fan of art blocks overall.
Art blocks is sick. Love art blocks.
I like a bunch of those collections.
And we like to be all high and mighty about our like freedom money, but we all love number go up. We're all like
For
Bitcoin
sure.
degens, you know. We get excited
I know.
when we hit a new all-time high, and that's part of what, you know. Of course, everybody is like kind of self-interested, and you've got to appeal to people's self-interest. I mean, I think that's what makes Bitcoin such a beautiful system, is that it appeals to everybody's self-interest and then gets them into a activity where there's no like violent interference with each other, right? If you're in a fiat money system, like, well, what do? I guess you try to like grab the reins of power and be the one at the money printer, right? On Bitcoin, what do you have to do? Well, I guess you just have to do capitalism and like make things for people to buy and sell things and try to get more coins. And it's sort of like a virtuous cycle. But at the root of that virtuous cycle is our own self-interest.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. It does create an interesting incentive alignment where the system actually thrives and builds on that, you know, selfish self-interest incentivization. One of the other things that has come out of inscriptions is, I think, largely not just inscriptions, but also Taproot and other recent Bitcoin developments, is this renewed interest in creating Bitcoin layer 2 networks.
Dude, it's wild. The at last count, I heard that we had like 82 or 84
I was
Bitcoin
told
L2s.
that we know of 65 roll-up projects, but then one of our venture investors told me it's 100, and then I interviewed Mike Dudas on this show, who's gotten very interested in Bitcoin layer 2s, his venture from Six Man Ventures. He said he's personally seen 200 decks.
Wow.
I don't know if these are all actual like L2s or whatever, but they're all like Bitcoin aligned, like DeFi and L2s. But a lot of them will post their data. If they're ZK rollups, for example, they have fraud proofs or whatever ZK data they need that's effectively call data on ETH or, you know, arbitrary data for the rollup in an inscription, because it's now there's a space and a method for posting slightly larger data.
Yep.
So that's one of those dominoes that you also set off a little bit. Not the only one.
No,
What are your thoughts on this overall?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really interesting because, you know, the things that they use from inscriptions is really just this very simple technique of putting data in a Bitcoin script that is really trivial. You know, I came up with it myself, but I came up with it because I sat down and tried to figure out how to put data in a Bitcoin transaction. Anybody who thought about it for a little bit would probably figure out the same thing. So it's not like it was some big technical innovation. I think it was actually just, it sparked everybody's imagination. It was like, hey, look, you can build things.
It really did
on
spark
Bitcoin.
imagination.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the best things that has come out of your Ordinals and inscriptions invention,
everybody
is that it has created a true renaissance of people asking again what might be possible to build on Bitcoin.
Absolutely. But then as far as where we are with the technical aspect of these projects is we're really like nowhere. We're really at this like sort of white paper stage. And I think it's really important for people to remember that when a system gets complicated enough, like an L2 or a rollup or whatever, it's really hard to figure out how it's actually going to work, if it's going to actually work, until it exists. When systems get complicated, the paper description doesn't tell you, you know, how it's going to behave once it's actually implemented. I think everybody should keep in mind the Lightning Network. So I'm a huge Lightning Network fan. I think it's a great technology. But if you were in, 2017 or whenever the white paper, the original Lightning Network white paper came out, you could have thought like, oh my God, this is incredible. This is the best thing since sliced bread. It solves all our problems. But as we've gotten experience with the Lightning Network, it turns out it is very hard to run a self-custodial wallet for a normal person. It's very hard to paper over all of the things that are happening behind the scenes, like channels openings, channel closing. You do have to go on chain. You have inbound and outbound liquidity management. And the Lightning Network is, I think, the best possible outcome in terms of actually producing something valuable. But we needed to get experience with the system to understand how it would actually behave. And right now, none of these L2s exist. They're just like fever dreams. We don't know if any of them are going to be really viable, if any of them are going to produce any level of reasonable decentralization. So I'm in a very much like wait and see.
Yeah.
I'm glad people are doing it. I think it's really cool that people are experimenting and researching, but who knows if anything is ever going to come of it.
Yeah, one of the things I love so much about this is when you have a more generalized blockchain like that uses an EVM or something where it's really quite easy to build. Well, the EVM has plenty of its own issues that I'm aware of, but it's I would say almost at least an order of magnitude easier to program an application on Ethereum than on Bitcoin.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that I like to put it is that when you program on Ethereum, you really mold Ethereum to your idea, right? You just tell Ethereum to do the thing that you want. And yeah, there's a lot of problems with that execution model, a lot of rough edges. You don't really need to adapt your idea too much to Ethereum. When you build on Bitcoin, the process of building on Bitcoin is figuring out how you can adapt your idea to the underlying chain. Inscriptions are based on Ordinals, which is this numbering and tracking of individual sats, which is really just an insane idea. Why would you go through these weird, like backflips to like do it? And it's because, well, that was the way that you could get the idea onto Bitcoin, figuring out how could you conceptualize something permanent that could be transferred across a transaction. And it's really, I didn't set out to be like, oh, I'm going to make trackable sats. That really was the best way to design the protocol. If you want to design for Bitcoin, you really can't take your idea and just kind of force it square peg in a round hole. You need to think like, okay, like how can I adapt my idea and make it work with the functionality that is available on Bitcoin?
That's one of the things that's so exciting about new ideas that happen on Bitcoin is that there's a real puzzle to solve. You have to bend the knee to Bitcoin network. That really sets it apart, right? Because the alternative has been for years, oh, well, we can't do it on Bitcoin, so let's just start a whole new blockchain and put whatever features we think we might need for that. And that's sort of a never-ending game. That's why we have like, I don't know, I was going to say dozens, hundreds, probably thousands of layer 1 blockchains, but at least hundreds of genuine ones. And it's also that technology innovation game that you can never really win, right? That's one thing I love about the fact that Bitcoin, the network, which isn't really an entity, but a distributed force, doesn't play that game. Instead, it's the reverse, where you got to come to Bitcoin. I would love to see the roll-ups somehow get on Bitcoin. I think roll-ups are interesting technology. They're sort of, in my mind, among the most clear distillings of just what do we really need here to actually use a distributed network, right? I mean, there's plenty of problems as well. There's no such thing as a decentralized sequencer today in the world, but
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I definitely wish them well. I hope somebody like cracks that nut.
Yeah. We were talking before, you have a new project that you're working on. I think I mentioned at the beginning, but in file sharing, I was going to say, you seem to be one of the common threads I'm seeing here is a true love of digital objects.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a giant nerd. I've been using computers since I was very young. I'm 41 now, and so born in 1983. And my mom and dad actually were very plugged into technology very early. My dad was an editor at PC World magazine.
Wow.
And my mom is a novelist, and she had a Mac like very early. She had one of the original, I think she had a Mac Plus, and so she let me like play with that thing. So I've been on computers for my whole life, and I love file sharing. And what we've seen with file sharing is that BitTorrent was very, very popular, the sort of dominant method of file sharing. Maybe between like 2010, 2015, really kind of had its ascendancy. But then as the streaming services have appeared, they've really competed with it on like a UI, UX basis. All Netflix, Spotify, they're all sort of like point and click. They're very easy. BitTorrent has all these components that you sort of have to use together. Well, you've got your tracker that you access via the web. You've got your torrent client. And then your torrent client can actually play any of the content.
Right.
You then need to download, VLC or some video player. You're not going to be able to use every format. If you want music, you have a library that you got to import things into. And so I'm trying to come up with a sort of all-in-one application that includes a file sharing network that sort of gets you this very nice, usable, end-to-end experience. And it's interesting. It's not exactly, it has nothing to do with cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. It's not a crypto project. And it's not exactly a technical project. BitTorrent works really well once you have the hash of the content that you want, finding peers who have that, who are interested in the same content and trading bits of that content back and forth until you have the whole thing. BitTorrent works phenomenally for that. I'm not really trying to improve on that. It's really a UI, UX problem, right? How can you sort of sand out BitTorrent, the BitTorrent experience's rough edges. In that way, it's kind of like Lightning, right? Like you have a system and it has some complicated, weird aspects to it, and you're like, well, how much can I stuff all that under the rug and let the user just like click the button that says does the thing?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm going to be successful. The core kind of idea behind it is that content on BitTorrent is really just kind of these bags of files. They're in a whole bunch of different formats. They're in a whole bunch of different like organization. And so it's really hard to build a unified user experience on top of that sea of content. What does Netflix build their user experience on top of? What they build on top of it is a database of every single piece of content in exactly the same format with a fixed metadata schema that lets you give this very sort of unified user experience. You just click the movie, it streams in a format that your browser can understand. So what I'm working on is sort of like a packaging format where you can package content for this network with actually a very strict schema that's very strict about what metadata you can and can't have and the file formats. So that on top of this sort of sea of strongly typed content, you can build a really good user experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And does the file sharing, the network protocol of it, is that also going to be new, or are you going to use BitTorrent basically? I'm
probably going to write it myself. I kind of do want to control the implementation. There are some small improvements that I want to make. BitTorrent is the main thing is that I don't actually think I get a whole lot by being interoperable with BitTorrent. That it's a legacy system. People would not really be interested in changing their existing practices within that legacy system.
So you don't think you get a lot of BitTorrent users coming over to your thing, and you're not really going after the hardcore BitTorrent users anyway.
At least not initially.
Yeah.
That it's going to be people who want to experiment with something new and not something which will incrementally improve the BitTorrent experience.
Interesting.
Yeah. So right now I'm in the depths. I'm working on Kademlia, which is a distributed hash table implementation that BitTorrent uses to find peers that are interested in that content. And I'm doing it's the first time I've really had to do really hardcore network programming, and it's hard. Ordinals and inscriptions, that stuff is all easy. Literally all I have to do is connect to Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core says what the new blocks are, process those blocks. I'm sort of shielded from the chaotic reality of being on the internet. But now I'm in there in the trenches, working on complicated algorithms, and it's rough.
Yeah, you just piggyback on top of the Bitcoin network, the Bitcoin protocol. You don't have to actually do that networking stuff. In fact, this is something people don't realize, but a lot of the stuff that gets updated in Bitcoin Core upgrades and in Bitcoin upgrades is networking layer stuff.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a huge, important part of the network.
Absolutely. I mean, essentially, Bitcoin is a network of untrusted peers, and doing any sort of complex communication with untrustworthy peers over the internet is just fraught with peril. Somebody sends you a message. You then have to allocate some memory for that message. How does that not turn into a situation where somebody can get you to allocate, an infinite amount of memory, crash your computer? So it's
there are issues with timeout. There's the thing Bloom filters. It was really important. These are the ways that the nodes communicate with each other.
Yep.
Right. So and that's not a consensus change even, right?
That's right.
A software messaging protocol.
Well, yeah, the nice thing about the peer-to-peer network is that it doesn't all need to be upgraded in lockstep like it does for the main chain. That if two peers, there's a new standard for encrypted communication over the Bitcoin P2P network, and nodes are free to support that or not. And if you talk to a node that doesn't support it, you can still fall back to the older.
You just talk to a different node, or you go back to the old one. Yeah, the backwards compatibility is really cool too. Yep. So, before we wrap, Casey, we're at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. You were saying something interesting to me about your impressions of where we are in this moment in Bitcoin. It's truly seeming kind of wild to me. I mean, we're just above the Enterprise Hall here, but Senator Cynthia Lummis was just speaking on the main stage. I think current independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is speaking in a few moments. What does that mean to you? I mean, what's the feeling that you're getting from this situation?
I mean, I think that, if you think Bitcoin is going to succeed in a really big way, the way that we all hope and think it can, it will enter a geopolitical era where it starts to become systemically important and systemically interesting. And it feels to me like we're maybe knocking on the door of that geopolitical era. Governments, they hold their own money, they hold the money of other states, they hold debt, but they've always been interested in gold. They've always been interested in gold as a reserve asset. And so that I see as the fundamental sort of beginning of the next era of Bitcoin. It's going to be central banks establishing a strategic reserve of Bitcoin, the asset, for their own, political ends. And that could really kick off a chain reaction very quickly. If a sitting U.S. president said we are going to establish a Bitcoin strategic reserve, the dam would break and things would get crazy really fast. And it's going to be a delicate era in Bitcoin's sort of journey, because we're going to start seeing these entities that do have a lot of power starting to be interested in this decentralized peer-to-peer network, and certainly trying to co-opt it, certainly trying to control it. I think the best possible outcome is going to be that they all fight each other for control of Bitcoin, and they actually all benefit from its neutrality. And so their strategy to participate in the network is actually just to strengthen it, to try to keep it neutral, all fighting over each other for more of the asset and more of the miners producing the asset. But ultimately, in a way, right, where through their own self-interests, they compete via actually strengthening the network. So
Right.
I think things are going to get weird. I think it's going to be the weirdest phase of
I really
Bitcoin's
do think
development.
so too. It's going to be very weird. RFK has a proposal to partially back the U.S. dollar with precious metals and Bitcoin. There's this rumor that has been started that former President Donald Trump, who's speaking here tomorrow, right? We're recording on Thursday, July 26th. He may announce something along these lines. It does feel like if the United States does basically, I don't think they need to establish a strategic reserve of coins, but a national Bitcoin policy or strategy. We're already the leader basically in this entire network. I think we have the most hash rate, but also probably the most coins literally custodied inside our borders. Yep. I would bet. And I would dare say, and I apologize to my friends in different countries, the most intellectual capital I bet is in the United States. Could be. So it is going to get weird. Casey, my friend, thank you so much for coming back on Galaxy Brains.
My pleasure. Thank you as always for having me. This has been great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXY Research. See you next week.